a lot, like, why are all our bees missing? All of our bees are having problems. You know, we need to do something. It's actually not all of our bees. So there are populations that are struggling. This here is a study from 2013 where they looked historically at bee populations, different groups of bees. Those that have lines below this 0, are in decline. Those that have lines above are increasing. And pollinators in general, their populations fluctuate pretty broadly from year to year. Some years you'll see tons of bees in your yard, tons of bumblebees, other years you won't. And that doesn't mean that they've all disappeared, it just means that something happened the year before that impacted the next year's population. And it will probably come back again the following year. So we get a lot of fluctuation, but we do see some troubling trends. We've had our first listed bumblebee, federally listed endangered bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee. We have not seen this in Maine since 2009. There's an effort right now to find whether there's any existing populations. I don't think that there is, and I'm pretty sure that we will not find it. I would be surprised if we did, since we haven't collected one since 2009. There are lots of threats to pollinators. It's not just one thing, but there are a couple important things that are making the largest impacts. We have pathogens and pests, so things like honeybees and bumblebees. There's a lot of pathogens and pests in those populations that jump around, and so that can be problematic. There's a mite on honeybees right now that it's like a tick for us. It's the equivalent, so a mite for this bee is like a tick. It sucks their vital fluids out of their bodies and gives them viruses, just like limes and deer ticks do for us. It's about the size, if bees were the same size as us, it would be about the size of a 5-pound cat feeding on us. So that's a pretty big parasite to be living on an organism. So imagine carrying around one of those, let alone some of these bees carry around 4, 5, 6 of them. Competition from invasives, remember that wool carder bee outcompetes our native bee problem. Reduced genetic diversity. Maine, luckily, is more forested than it's ever been before. Unfortunately, forests are not the best for bees and bee populations, and so we have fragmentation of habitat. Agricultural kind of hotspots and areas separated by forests, and so populations of bees kind of get bottlenecked, their genetics get bottlenecked in those areas. So there's some reducing of genetic diversity. Loss and fragmentation of habitat, this is a big one. Like I said, Maine is highly forested now, and forests are not the best for most of our pollinators. So increasing forage and nesting sites is important. Climate change, this is another really big one for, especially in Maine. We're seeing several different things, more frequent extreme shifts in weather. We have a lot of bees that are ground nesters, they nest in the ground. If you're getting 4 inches of rain in an hour, which we seem to be getting pretty frequently nowadays, really torrential downpour, that will flood out nests and drown those bees that are nesting in there. Shifts in phenology of flowering plants. So typically your bees will be emerging the same time as the plants are flowering, but we're seeing shifts in that now. So where either the bees or the flowers are coming out before the counterparts there, or they're delayed, or they're overshooting, and so we're seeing these shifts of things flowering at weird times and the bees not emerging in sync with them. And then finally, we find that there's reduced nutritional content in some of our flowers. So historically, in Maine, our last big pollen source for bees is going to be goldenrod and asters. So there was a study looking at goldenrod pollen, and we find that nowadays it has 1/3 less protein content than it did historically. So bees have to forage that much more for the same amount of protein. And so they have to work that much harder. So 1/3 is quite a lot. And then there's also pesticide exposure. So what can we do? That's the big question that I always get. And I'm going to focus a lot of this towards stuff that can happen at schools, that can either be student, teacher, or administration-led kind of things. And the big one is providing forage and nesting habitats. So how many of you at your schools have pollinator gardens? Well, that's good. 4, good. 5, good. Excellent. That's something that's really easy to set up, and it really takes very low maintenance, but it can have a big reward, and it can be, you know, a tool that you use on campus to kind of talk about some of these things with the students. So you have 2 other fact sheets that I gave you. One is plants, and one is how to make bee nesting sites, and then also plants that are good for bees. But with food, you need to provide nectar and pollen, so both sugar amino acids and pollen, which is the protein. Most gather nectar from several different flowers, and that really depends on the tongue length. So you need to have multiple different types of sizes of flowers. A bee with a really long tongue can get deep into those flowers and get like bell-shaped flowers, get the nectar at the bottom. Those with little short tongues can only reach short flowers, nectar resources that are short flowers. So having a variety of them is really important. Pollen collection is usually more selective. Some will use anything, others focus on a specific type of plant. So the more variation you can have, the more likely you're going to hit upon a variety of different pollinators. When you're looking at flowers, bee flowers are kind of a little specific. Bees like bilateral symmetry, so one side of the flower looks the same as the other. They like tube-like or bell-shaped flowers with a nectar reservoir, so they like to be able to stick their tongue down into something and collect nectar at the bottom. And they like flowers that require a complex behavior to get a reward. So they like to learn. They like, well, I don't know if they like it, but they do it. And they prefer flowers that they have to work at to get to the reward. So a good example is blueberry flowers. So blueberry flowers hang upside down. They're really hard to get into to get to the nectar. It's a really small opening, and you see bumblebees getting in there trying to get in there all the time. What bumblebees do is, since they co-evolved, the bumblebees will hang upside down and they'll buzz. They'll go bzz, bzz. And what that buzzing does, it's a certain frequency that releases the pollen in there, and the nectar, which falls down on the stomach of the bee, then they collect it and go on to the next one. You'll see it with tomato flowers as well. Has anybody else seen that? Where a bee is hanging upside down and they'll shake it just really quickly, and that's releasing the pollen. So they love that kind of, those flowers that have a complex behavior to get to that reward. It's called buzz pollination or sonication. You can look for videos of it, it's amazing. And they like yellow, white, blue, or purple flowers, typically with UV markers. So we can't see that, we don't see in the UV spectrum with our eyeballs, but bees of course do. So this is cinquefoil, plain old little yellow flower. This is what it looks like to a bee. This flower is saying this is where the nectar's at. This is where you want to be. Dandelion, same thing. This is what a bee sees, a big red bullseye where that nectar is. But so what they see is very different from us. So even if it looks really boring to us, it's not a showy, beautiful lily or something, they're really important still for our bees. So when you want to plant a bee garden, you want to plant native plants or well-behaved non-native plants. You don't want to be planting stuff that's going to take over and run pure chaos everywhere. So native or well-behaved non-native. Plant a diversity of plants to support a variety of pollinators, so many different styles of flower, shapes, sizes. You want to have 3 things blooming throughout the growing season, because if you have just things that bloom in May and then nothing until September, those bees are not going to stick around. They're not going to take up residence there. They need food the whole time. You want to plant in clumps. Remember how the bees are kind of learning as they're going from flower to flower. If you plant all of your daisies in one clump, like blueberries all in one clump, they don't have to learn between, like if you plant a daisy here and a daisy here and a daisy here and other things in between, when they go from flower to flower, they have to relearn each time, and it's less efficient for them. So if you plant them in a clump, then they can just go from the same flowers, and it's more efficient for them to collect resources. And then you want to have different heights. Some of these bees are teeny. They're like the size of a small ant. And they don't forage very far, and they don't forage high off the ground. And so you want to have plants that are flowering right near the ground, all the way up to your sunflowers that bees and bumblebees will use. And so continuously blooming throughout the season. This is just starts with snowdrops and forsythia and daffodils, and ends up here with daylilies, dahlias, mums throughout the season. Same thing, fruit trees, or some of our flowering trees and fruit trees, all the way down to some of our asters and goldenrod. And besides food, you need to provide nesting resources. So 70% of our solitary bees nest in the ground, 30% in stems, and then bumblebees and honeybees are cavity nesters. They need a big open or big area to nest have all those babies and stuff in. And so with ground nesting, this is a reason to convince your school not to dig up the ball field all the time and level it or whatever they do with it. I see it all the time. There's a ton of bees that love compact ball fields to nest in, and that's a great place. Those other paths around the school that are like, those dirt paths where kids are walking all the time or students are walking, those are really great nesting spots too. This was an area about double the size of this room, and we stopped counting at like 2,000 nests in just that one area. So these very small areas can actually be really important for some of our ground nesting bees.